In this demonstration I'd like to show you the Sandpaper Aquatint. I first became interested in the possibilities of making a Sandpaper Aquatint when I visited a gallery and saw the work of a 1930s American printmaker by the name of Martin Lewis. When I looked into the exquisite way in which he had produced some of his etchings, I discovered, as I say, that he was using sandpaper. So I came straight back to my studio and had an experiment by using, and was pleasantly surprised to see that whereas possibly using a traditional ground, the pressure of the sandpaper on the surface could probably quite easily destroy the ground, because Big has one of the qualities that it is in fact quite tough. It has the ability to retain its stability on the surface of the plate without being destroyed. I first started off by using quite a coarse emery paper. I don't say it's sandpaper. The particular grade of the emery paper is denoted by the number on the back. The lower the number, the coarser the actual emery paper. And of course, if you use a coarse emery paper, then you're going to probably find you'll have a much more granular aquatint, more akin to a much coarser resin aquatint. As you move up the gradations of fineness of emery paper, this one's a 500. I would say that a 500 grit is probably about the finest that you'd need to achieve an aquatint very similar to the icing sugar aquatint. So for this demonstration we're going to use the finer aquatint, and I'll show you very easily how you coat, or rather transform, a straightforward hard ground. This plate has already been prepared with a hard ground on it, and I'm just going to simply run this through the press in order to create our aquatinted surface on the plate. Now of course, when you put the emery paper down on top of your plate, it's important that of course it doesn't start slipping and sliding around on the surface. So when it goes down, be very careful that of course it doesn't move when you lower your blankets onto the surface of the paper. So we're going to run this through the press now. Standard pressure, no less or no more. And when we lift that off, the tiny little bits of grit in the surface of the emery paper would have punctured the surface of this plate and will have created very tiny holes. Now you have to repeat this process a number of times, and what I've discovered is if you look at the 500 grit for this particular paper, because it's a very fine grit, then you would probably be looking at putting this through the press 10 times. Effectively what I'm saying is, if it's a 500, look at the 100 figure and double that, so the 5 becomes 10. So this will go through the press 10 times. Each time I will move the position of the emery paper so we have a slightly different position in order for more holes to be punctured through the surface of this plate. So I'll lower this down again now, and it'll go through the press again. So 10 times of this one. With the coarser aquatint, which I will achieve using the 220, then of course that's 2.2, so we basically say we'll put that one through 5 times. So this plate has been through the press 10 times now, so there are tiny little puncture holes in this ground covering the entire surface. Now this plate I've prepared because I'd like to use it in a very similar way to the mezzotint. In other words, I'm going to put this into the ferric chloride for 45 minutes. And that will give me a solid black surface, which I will then start to use my scraper burnisher to bring out lighter tones in this conventional way as you would for a mezzotint. 45 minutes is the correct time, roughly, that you would need to create a black. I say roughly because of course you need to make your own test using your own acids. I recommend that you have your ferric chloride at around 30 to 35 bar. Now you need to obviously use a hydrometer to make sure that that is the correct measurement of your ferric chloride. But again, the temperature and how old the ferric chloride will have an influence. So as I say, I do stress that you should make your own tests. If you're using a coarser aquatint, as I said in the demonstration for icing sugar at the very beginning of that, I did state that the finer the aquatint that you're achieving, the quicker you will reach black. And it's all to do with how closely those tiny little puncture holes, in our case, are to each other. With a coarser aquatint, using a much coarser emery paper, there are larger lumps that have been punctured into the surface of the ground. They will be further apart, so for that reason you'll probably find to achieve a total black you could be looking at just over an hour, but again you need to make your own tests. The possibilities of the kinds of diverse ways that you can use a sandpaper aquatint are endless. This is the very first image which I made using the sandpaper aquatint. I call it sandpaper, of course, but as you know we have been using emery paper. I used a fairly coarse aquatint because I wasn't really sure of how far I could take the actual pressing of these tiny puncture holes in the ground before it would start to break the ground down. So I started fairly cautiously with an aquatint which has, as you see, I think it was like something like a 120 grit emery paper. But during the actual process of putting the emery paper on top of the plate, sending it through the press, of course I wasn't quite so careful about where I covered the plate. So in fact I didn't cover the plate completely all over in the same way. So in some areas you can see here, these lighter areas are where I haven't gone over the plate as many times, so I've actually missed some of those areas. That was a mistake, but one of the wonderful things about the process of etching, of course, is the fact that you can make mistakes, but what it actually does is open up possibilities for other ways of working. So what I really discovered from this mistake is the fact that you can in fact gradate your tones by simply reducing the amount of times that you put the emery paper through the press. So in effect, you can create different tones without having to etch the plate any longer. This is illustrated here as well. If you look at this image here, where we have this gradation of tone from black at the very bottom to a lighter grey at the top, that tonal range wasn't achieved by a gradation of time in the acid. It was actually achieved by creating a step wedge of newsprint. And because the pressure was less at the bottom, where there's only one sheet of newsprint and so on, the pressure down here wasn't so great, so I wasn't getting so much pressure onto the surface of the ground. It wasn't being punctured as deeply. So in fact, just with one shot in the acid, I was getting this wonderful gradation of tone. So you can imagine all the different kinds of ways that you could manipulate your tone with just one shot into the acid. But that's not all. If you look at this image here, at first glance, okay, I apologise for the poor drawing, but if you look at this image, at first glance, most people would say, oh, well, this was achieved in the traditional way into a soft ground. But that wasn't the case. What I did here was to lay a sheet of fairly coarse emery paper onto the surface. I'll show you here with this piece of copper, which has been coated with ground. So all I did was I very carefully placed the hard grounded plate down on top of the emery paper, pulled it round, taped it down on both sides so that it wouldn't move, and then if you use a fairly hard pencil you can actually do your drawing into the surface because you're pressing and puncturing that ground. And when you obviously do that, this is how you achieve this very pencil-like image. And even the amount that you actually draw into the surface is related in the kinds of tones that you can achieve. So yet another way in which you can use this sandpaper aquatint to achieve very interesting kinds of pencil marks, something which you would expect to see in a soft ground. you can see how much finer this aquatint is. This is an aquatint using a 500 grit sandpaper, and you can see it's very fine here. And this whole plate initially started life as a solid black, and it's just by using that scraper burnisher that I've gradually brought out some of the more subtle tones that you can see in the image. Going back to the first image I made, I thought I'd just explain a little bit more about what I did with this image to bring it round to the state that you can see it here. Initially, I did a line etching. Once I'd created the line etching, I then coated the plate again with another hard ground. I then put the sandpaper on top that you can see here, and then started to gradate the tones by stopping out and putting it in the acid for obviously different lengths of time. Once I'd done that and I got a fairly subtle range of tones, I then put a soft ground on top, and I rubbed into the soft ground through tracing paper, which would lift some of the ground and help create some of these more subtle tones. So these areas here are obviously of where I've lifted some of the ground, the soft ground, away. And finally, and probably more interestingly, I will show another demonstration which will show what we call the double drop. Now the double drop is where you use the same plate and effectively use two different colours. And because this is a fairly coarse aquatint on this image, that slight movement, you never get absolute hairline register, and those two little pinpricks of ink, one in this case in a sort of terracotta and the other one in a blue, gives this very crumbly and almost moving kind of aquatint. And then finally the last plate which I've put on top, which you can see evidence of around here, so a second plate in aluminium. In fact, I created a marble plate, and again I'll explain how to make a marble plate in another demonstration.